Chapter 9, Factorial Designs. So far, the experimental studies we have been discussing in the previous chapters involve a single independent variable. For example, in chapter 1, the textbook authors discussed findings by Simone, Schnell, and colleagues, which suggest that people see morally wrong actions as less wrong after washing their hands compared to those who did not wash their hands. In a similar theme study, the same researchers investigated whether feeling physically disgusted causes people to make harsher moral judgments. But this study has two independent variables. One was the level of cleanliness of the room that participants were in, and they were randomly assigned to either a clean room or a messy room, which was filled with dirty, dirty dishes, an overflowing trash can, and a chewed up pen. Just sound like just like my kid's room. Um, Another independent variable was the score of private body consciousness. This score was obtained by asking participants to fill out a self-report questionnaire that measures the amount of attention that people pay to their own bodily sensations. So, individuals who focus more on their own bodily sensations generally score higher than those who pay less attention to their sensations. The dependent variable was the harshness of people's moral judgments. That is, participants were asked to rate the moral acceptability of different behaviors, such as this is kind of disgusting, but eating one's dead dog and failing to return a found wallet on a scale of 1 to 7. They were also asked to rate their current level of disgust and other emotions. Researchers found that, not surprisingly, participants who were in the messy room were more discussed, but they also made harsher moral judgments than participants in the clean room, but only if they scored relatively high in private body consciousness. In other words, room's cleanliness affects moral judgments only for individuals who pay more attention to their bodily sensations. If you are someone who does not pay much attention to your bodily sensations, then the room's cleanliness does not really influence your moral judgments. When reading research articles, you will often see a factorial design, which involves more than one independent variable, like the study we just discussed. In this chapter, we will explore how and why researchers choose to use factorial designs. By the way, factor and independent variable are the same thing. I refer to an independent variable as factor and vice versa interchangeably. All right, section 41, setting up a factorial experiment. Psychological scientists often include multiple levels of a single independent variable in their studies, but I believe it is even more common to include more than one independent variable in their study. When researchers include multiple independent variables, their study uses a factorial design. So, how can we tell if a research article you are reading uses a factorial design? One way to one way is to read the method section, but an easier way may be to check the journal article titles. So these are some of the examples. The effect of temporal delay and orientation on haptic object recognition. Opening closed minds, the combined effect of intergroup contact and need for closure on prejudice. Effects of experiences and coping on pain-induced intentions to smoke. The effect of age and divided attention on spontaneous recognition. And finally, the effects of reduced food size and package size on the consumption behavior on restrained and unrestrained eaters. Including more independent variables makes the research more complex. Therefore, it is more challenging to analyze data, but researchers may choose to do so anyway if they want to answer research questions in a single study rather than separate ones. Additionally, and perhaps more importantly, including more than one independent variable in a single study allows researchers to investigate whether one independent variable interacts with another independent variable. This is called an interaction between independent variables. For example, Chanel and her colleagues observed an interaction between disgust and private body consciousness, as the impact of disgust varied depending on whether participants scored high or low in private body consciousness. Here's another example of a factorial design. In the natural environment, our world is affected by more than one independent variable. Sometimes researchers examine the combined effects of multiple independent variables. I used to live in a small town in Missouri, and although it's slightly cooler, the climate is generally similar to Oklahoma's. So it was never a question of whether you want an AC in your apartment, especially during summer. Then I moved to Reno, Nevada during the summer, and I was shocked to learn that my new apartment did not have the AC, but was completely fine even when the outside temperature reached 100 degrees. It turns out in Reno in the middle of summer, I would stop sweating once I was under a tree or inside my apartment because of the low humidity. If you don't have an AC in Oklahoma during the summer, that will be a disaster. And I know you know what I'm talking about if you have ever experienced your AC breaking down in the middle of summer in Oklahoma. So, if you want to investigate the effects of climate on test performance, for example, you want to include not just the temperature, but also humidity as independent variables. The graph you see on the slide is hypothetical research findings. The x-axis shows the temperature, high versus low, and the y-axis shows the test score, high versus low. The test score is the dependent variable, right? Two different lines indicate humidity, with the blue line indicating high humidity and the pink line indicating low humidity. The graph shows that the test score is not much affected by different temperatures alone. However, the test score is low only when both the temperature and the humidity are high. Whereas at lower temperatures, humidity does not have an effect. This illustrates a spreading interaction. Without manipulating the humidity level as an independent variable in this type of experiment, your research findings may be very much limited. As discussed, factorial design includes at least two independent variables, or factors, and each level of one independent variable is combined with each level of another factor. You remember that an independent variable or factor has to have at least two levels. So, in the simplest factorial design, there will be two factors, and each independent variable has two levels. For example, look at the left table, or I should say figure. Let's say there are factor A with two levels, A1 and B, um, A1 and A2. Okay, um, so factor A has two levels, right? A1 and A2. And a factor B has two levels, B1 and B2. In one condition, A1 and B1 are presented simultaneously. In the second condition, A2 and B2 are presented simultaneously. In the third condition, A1 and B2 are presented simultaneously. Finally, in the last condition, A2 and B2 are presented simultaneously. This design is called a 2 by 2 factorial design, and 2 times 2 is 4, so there will be a total of 4 conditions. If one factor or independent variable has three levels and another independent variable has two levels, then it's called 3 by 2 factorial design. And there will be a total of six conditions. Finally, if there are three factors and each has two levels, it's called a 2 by 2 by 2 factorial design. There will be a total of eight conditions because 2 times 2 times 2. Let's take another example. Look at the right figure. Researchers want to investigate the effect of cell phone use and the time of day on driving ability. The columns of the figure represent cell phone use, and the rows represent time of day. The four cells of the figure represent the four possible combinations or conditions. While driving, participants would use a cell phone during the day in the first condition. They would not be using a cell phone during the day in the second condition. They will be using a cell phone at night in the third condition. And finally, in the last condition, they will not be using a cell phone at night while they are driving. Because there are two independent variables with two levels each, this is a 2 by 2 factorial design. Technically, factorial designs can include any number of independent variables and levels you choose. For example, look at the figure in the slide. This experiment includes the type of psychotherapy, cognitive versus behavioral, the length of psychotherapy, 2 weeks versus 2 months, and the gender of the psychotherapist, female versus male. So this is a 2 by 2 by 2 factorial design, and there are eight conditions. However, you probably will not see in an experiment with more than three factors. The reason this design isn't popular is that as you can kind of see for yourself, it becomes too complicated to analyze the data. Imagine adding another level to the length, like 2 years, making this a 3 by 2 by 2 factorial design with 12 conditions. If you add another factor with two levels, such as therapist experience with low versus medium versus high, it will make it 3 by 2 by 2 by 3 factorial design with 36 conditions. You can see how quickly the number of conditions can grow by adding just one more level or factor. Another reason that an experiment with more than two factors is not popular is that it becomes harder to assign enough participants to each condition as the number of conditions grows. Of course, including numerous factors and levels can enhance studies' external validity, as in the natural world, multiple factors collectively influence human behavior, as illustrated in hypothetical study on the effect of temperature and humidity. However, this complexity can become unmanageable when too many factors and levels are involved, making the study difficult to conduct and analyze. So in this chapter, we will focus only on designs with two independent variables, but the basic principles can be expanded to more complex factorial designs. In the previous chapters, we discussed the difference between subject design, where participants are randomly assigned to one of the conditions, and a within subjects factorial design, where the participants are repeatedly tested in all conditions. In factorial design, researchers decide separately for each factor or independent variable whether to use a between subjects or within subjects approach. In a between subjects factorial design, all factors are manipulated across different groups of subjects. So, in a 2 by 2 factorial design, for example, participants would be randomly assigned to one of the four conditions. In within subjects factorial design, all of the factors are manipulated within subjects. So, in a 2 by 2 factorial design, all participants will be tested in all four conditions. The advantages and disadvantages of these two methods are similar to those outlined in previous chapters. The between subject design is simple, no need to worry about order or carryover effects, and it reduces the time and effort required from each participant. In contrast, the within subject design is more efficient for researchers and better at controlling extraneous variables related to participants, which leads to finding statistical significance more easily. Because factorial designs include multiple factors, researchers can vary one independent variable between subjects and another within subjects. This is called a mixed factorial design. For example, a researcher might treat cell phone use as a within subjects independent variable by testing the same participants both while using a cell phone and while not using one, with the order counterbalanced. Conversely, they might consider time of a day between subjects independent variable by testing each participant either during the day or at night. In this mixed design, each participant would be tested under two of the four possible conditions. Whether the design involves between subjects, within subjects, or mixed approaches, participants are usually assigned to conditions or condition order randomly. Sometimes one of the independent variables in a factorial design is not manipulated by researchers. For example, remember the disgust and private body consciousness study by Schnall and colleagues? One factor was disgust, which was manipulated by researchers by randomly assigning participants either to a clean room or dirty room. Another independent variable was private body consciousness, which was not manipulated but measured by researchers. This type of research design is very common, and there are several important points to consider. First, non-manipulated factors typically include participant variables such as private body consciousness, hypochondriasis, self-esteem, gender, and similar traits. Although participants cannot be randomly assigned to these variables, each participant falls into only one category. This inherently makes these variables between subjects factors. For example, individuals usually cannot be low and high in self-esteem. Second, these studies are typically regarded as experiments as long as at least one independent variable is manipulated, regardless of the number of non-manipulated factors included. Third, it is important to remember that causal conclusions are only valid for the manipulated independent variable. For instance, Chanel and her colleagues were justified in concluding that disgust influenced the severity of their participants' moral judgments because they manipulated this variable and randomly assigned participants to either a clean or messy room. However, they would not have been justified in concluding that participants' private body consciousness influenced the severity of their moral judgments because they did not manipulate that variable. For instance, having a strict moral code and an increased awareness of one's body might both stem from a third factor, such as neuroticism. Therefore, it is important to distinguish between variables that are manipulated and those that are not manipulated in a study. So far, we have been seeing that the factorial experiments can involve manipulated factors or a mix of manipulated and non-manipulated factors. However, factorial designs can also consist only of non-manipulated factors. When that happens, there are no longer experiments but are considered a non-experimental. For example, imagine a hypothetical study where a researcher measures participants' moods and self-esteem levels, classifying them as either positive or negative moods and high or low self-esteem, along with their willingness to engage in unprotected sex. This setup is a 2 by 2 factorial design with mood, positive versus negative, and self-esteem, high versus low, as non-manipulated between subjects factors. The dependent variable in this case is the willingness to have unprotected sex. Since neither factor was manipulated by researchers in this example, it is considered a non-experimental study rather than an experimental one. The reason this difference is important is that an independent variable is not manipulated. A cause and effect relationship cannot be claimed. Similar to a correlational study, there are issues such as directionality and third variable problems. For example, an unrelated third variable might influence a participant's mood and their willingness to engage in unprotected sex. Researchers would not be able to determine this because the independent variables are not manipulated. 42. Interpreting the results of a factorial experiment. I think this is the last section. The graph shown on the slide depicts the results of a hypothetical factorial experiment with two independent variables. One independent variable is on the x-axis, and the other independent variable is indicated by different colors. The y-axis always represents the dependent variable. This graph illustrates that one independent variable is the time of day, comparing day versus night, while the other independent variable is cell phone use, comparing no cell phone versus cell phone. The dependent variable is driving performance, and this is a 2 by 2 factorial design. You could also choose to display a cell phone use on the x-axis and use different colored bars for time of day. The choice relies on which format researchers believe best communicates the results. The second graph displays the results of a 4 by 2 design where one of the variables is quantitative. This variable, psychotherapy length, is shown on the x-axis, while the other variable, psychotherapy type, is represented by lines with different formats. This is a line graph rather than a bar graph because the variable on the x-axis uh, is a quantitative with few distinct levels. Line graphs are also suitable for showing measurements taken over time on the x-axis, referring to time series data. In factorial designs, three types of results are typically examined: main effects, interaction effects, or just simply interaction, and simple effects. A main effect refers to the impact of one independent variable on the dependent variable, averaged over the levels of the other independent variable. It indicates whether there is a general difference caused by that single independent variable. The top graph shows a main effect of cell phone use as the participants showed better driving performance when not using cell phones, indicated by higher blue bars compared to red bars. It also demonstrates a main effect of time of day with better driving performance during the day than at night, regardless of cell phone use. These main effects are independent, meaning that the presence of one does not imply the presence of the other. The bottom graph clearly illustrates a main effect of psychotherapy duration. The longer the therapy, the more effective it was. Next, an interaction effect, or just interaction. The interaction occurs when one independent variable depends on the level of another independent variable. For example, remember my hypothetical example of factorial design on temperature and humidity. The test score is negatively affected only if both temperature and humidity are high. In other words, whether or not the temperature influences the test score depends on the level of humidity. This is an example of spreading interactions as previously discussed. Another example of interaction is that the effect of psychotherapy depends on whether people are motivated to change. Schnall and her colleagues' experiment on private body consciousness also shown an interaction effect. The influence of whether the room was clean or messy on participants' moral judgments varied depending on their level of private body consciousness. For those high in private body consciousness, participants in the messy room made stricter moral judgments. In contrast, for those low in private body consciousness, the cleanliness of the room had no impact on their judgments. Usually, an interaction is more important than main effects or simple effects because if you are interested in main effects, you can simply conduct one study with one independent variable and another with another independent variable. The whole reason why you are conducting a factorial experiment is to see if multiple independent variables are interacting with each other. There are two types of interactions. The one is called spread interactions, which you already discussed. And a graph on this slide also depicts spreading interactions. In this graph, the independent variable B has an effect at the level 2 of the independent variable A. That is, there is a difference in the height of the blue and pink bars on the right side of the graph, but no effect at level 1 of the independent variable A. That is, there is a little difference in the height of the blue and the pink bars on the left side of the graph. Notice there is the gap here on this graph, but as long as two lines are not parallel to each other, we have an interaction, whether one end of the line crosses or not. So we still have an interaction even when these two lines are crossed because they are not parallel to each other. However, when two lines cross, it is called crossover interactions. To summarize, in spreading interactions, one independent variable has an effect at one level of the other independent variable, but there is either a weak effect or no effect of that independent variable at the other level of the second independent variable. Datasets can be shown in a line graph like the one we saw in the previous slides, but researchers can also use a bar graph like this one. And we also saw another one in the previous slide. If you don't know whether there is an interaction or not, you can simply connect the top portion of each of the bars and connect with the bar with the same color, like this. If these two lines are not parallel to each other, then we have an interaction. When researchers find an interaction, there may not be main effects. Think of the example of a crossover interaction where introverts were found to perform better on verbal test performance than extroverts when they had not ingested any caffeine. But extroverts were found to perform better than introverts when they had ingested caffeine. In other words, when a verbal test was given, introverts would do better without caffeine, but extroverts would do better with caffeine. To examine the effect, the main effect of caffeine consumption, the researchers would have averaged across introversion and extroversion and simply looked at whether overall those who ingested caffeine had better or worse verbal memory test performance. So first, we calculate the average between 10 and 4, which is 7. Next, we calculate the average between 10 and 4, which is also 7. Because there is no difference between these two averages, there is no main effect of caffeine consumption. We also calculate the average of these data points, which is 7, perform the same calculation with this pair, which yields 7. Because there is no difference between these two averages, we conclude that there is no main effect of personality. Just because there are no main effects, it does not mean there is no effect of caffeine or no effect of personality. What we see in this example is that the effects of caffeine on verbal test performance depends on personality. Once we establish that there is an overall interaction effect, we need to break down this effect by looking at simple effects to conduct a more detailed analysis. In other words, while an interaction simply informs us that the effects of at least one independent variable depends on the level of another independent variable, analysis of simple effects allows us to analyze where this difference is coming from. So, what does a simple effects analysis enable researchers to assess? It looks at the influence of each independent variable at every level of the other variable. A simple effects analysis involves looking at how caffeine affects introverts and then how it affects extroverts. As previously discussed, the researchers investigated how personality impacts performance in both no caffeine and caffeine conditions. They found that without caffeine, introverts outperformed extroverts. Conversely, with caffeine, extroverts performed better than introverts. In a 2 by 2 design, this setup allows for examining two main effects and four simple effects. Schnall and colleagues identified a main effect of disgust on moral judgments, noting that individuals in a messy room judged morally more harshly. They also discovered an interaction between private body consciousness and disgust, indicating that the influence of disgust depended on person's level of private body awareness. This interaction suggests that the main effect may be somewhat misleading. Specifically, only half of the participants, those with high private body consciousness, showed a link between disgust and harsher moral judgments. Simple effects analysis confirmed that for individuals high in private body consciousness, disgust influenced moral judgments, whereas for individuals low in private body consciousness, there was no such effect. Examining the impact of disgust at each level of body consciousness allows researchers to clarify the nature of this interaction. Remember, analyzing simple effects helps to clarify the interaction, so you only need to perform these analyses if an interaction exists. If no interaction is present, the main effects will provide a full and accurate understanding. Okay, last slide. Let's summarize the statistical analysis involved in factorial design. For a 2 by 2 factorial design, we analyze one interaction. And an interaction occurs when the effect of one independent variable depends on the level of another independent variable. The interaction is the main reason why researchers are conducting a factorial research study. We also analyze two main effects because there are two independent variables. Main effect analysis is conducted by averaging the effect of the other independent variable as if the other independent variable does not exist. Finally, we analyze four simple effects. Simple effects analysis are conducted to examine the effects of each independent variable at each level of the other independent variable. Therefore, 2 plus 2 equals 4 simple effects for 2 by 2 factorial design. For 2 by 3 factorial design, we analyze one interaction, two main effects, since we have two independent variables, and five simple effects, since 2 plus 3 is 5. Finally, for 3 by 3 factorial design, we analyze one interaction, two main effects, and six simple effects as 3 plus 3 equals 6. As demonstrated, the main effects count is directly related to the number of independent variables, whereas the number of simple effect analysis depends on the levels of those independent variables. This is the end of chapter 9.